Hello, my name is Dariia, and today we'll be talking about salinization again. Here's a short overview of today's lecture. We'll start from understanding salinization, and then we'll go into recognizing salinization on your field, and then we'll smoothly transition into how different plants tolerate salinity differently. Here we go. I consider that a man's brain originally is like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. Now, the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. A little disclaimer, in this lecture we will follow Sherlock Holmes' advice, and as skillful workmen we will be very careful about what we take into our little limited attics. Don't get me wrong, all scientific classifications and terms are very important in very specific contexts, but today we'll be talking about things that are more practical and down to earth, something that will actually be useful to us in making informed decisions on our fields. There are 4 common minerals that lead to soil salinization, being chlorite, sulfate, carbon, and a mix of all 3 of them or 2 of them. If it's carbon prevailing in the soil solution, then it's considered to be carbon salinization. If it's a mix of all 3 of them, it's mixed salinization, and so on. It's very intuitive. However, salinization can also be classified by degree, or simply speaking, by the total amount of soluble salts present in the soil solution. In this table, we see numbers for different degrees of salinization. Everything that is below 0.1% is considered to be non-salinized soils, and everything that is more than 1.2% is considered to be solin checks, something we already talked about in the previous video. And to know the degree of your soil salinization, you have to have Soil Lab report on your hands, and I really want to reiterate it once more. It is extremely important to be able to interpret whatever is written on your lab reports, each and every agrochemical marking. This is the instance when scientific classifications do come in handy. Otherwise, you might lose your entire harvest or make your field unusable for years after. Sometimes high salinity is quite obvious, and in some cases, even an old and neglected salinization problem can be cured. And I want to show you some examples. This photo of paddy fields in Odessa Oblast, Ukraine, was made by agroanalyst specialists several years ago. Here, salts protrude to the surface so much that you probably won't win a prize if you say it's a solin check. And this photo of a field in Jambul region in Kazakhstan is another example of solin check visible to naked eye. Here, salts started to protrude to the dry soil surface even after plowing. And although the soil in both of these photos is obviously salinized, you still need to do soil lab testing for that very reason that it still might be usable. That's what the owners of this field in Odessa did. They conducted soil analysis and based on it leached salts from the soil and got a solid harvest of rice that year. But all this is salinity at its finest, when the problem is visible from the outside. Our goal is to identify the issue at the very beginning, at the earliest stages possible, when the solutions to salinization are much cheaper, easier, and much more reliable. The first thing you might want to check on your field is the plants already growing. On saline soils, plants are usually dry. They have thin, hard stems and petioles. Their leaves are abnormally dark and small, and overall their growth can be characterized as stunted. This is a classic scene of broccoli cabbage growing on saline soils, and you can recognize all the symptoms that I just mentioned. Another possible plant's reaction to saline conditions is slowed growth, smaller size, and deterioration of the root system, all of which you can see in this photo of strawberry seedlings that are, by definition, very sensitive to salinity. And in the second photo, you can see how root systems of strawberries look under different salinity conditions. Signs of increased salinity can be leaves appearance. Usually it's changes in color or shriveling or curling that makes the leaves look like little boats. In this photo of a bell pepper grown in Termes, southern Uzbekistan, you can see this shriveling of the leaves due to a high salt content in the soil, which is also quite obvious from the salt crust. And in melons, for example, edges of the leaves usually become more necrotic and yellow. Another sign of salt poisoning is an abnormal shift in plants' development towards the generative side, when the sufficient vegetative mass of plants hasn't formed yet, but the buds, flowers, and fruits are starting to grow already. On this photo, you can see 2 or 3 branches of this tomato bush are starting to grow, despite the plant's overall weakness. And back to broccoli, here we see an already appearing weak head, even though the rest of the plant looks quite miserable. If there are no cultivated plants on your field yet, you can look at the weeds as well. The presence and abundance of the so-called halophytes is a really warning sign. The typical halophytes are wormwood, saltwort, glasswort, tamarisk, camelthorn, and halocylon. I really hope I pronounced that correctly. But if you see them on your field, it is by no means a reason to say no to the field. But it's a reason to do a relatively inexpensive and easy cation-anion analysis of your soil water extract, which in this case is probably more important than even a test on nutrients content. So let's talk about that. Soil electrical conductivity test is one of the easiest ways to determine soil salinity. It's usually measured with conductivity meters, and the way it works is pretty simple. The higher the concentration of salt in the soil, the better it conducts electricity, and so a higher number will appear on the screen. But the simple test also has a very specific methodology, as all of the agrochemical tests do. First, you should sample the soil and let it dry to a very light, powder-like state. Then you should measure a precise amount of soil mass and add distilled water to it. Then let it rest and settle for a little bit. And only after that, you can start measuring the soil conductivity. Now, why the test on soil electrical conductivity is so important? First of all, it's very accessible for any farmer. And it's really easy to interpret without external help from agricultural labs. This is an example of the so-called Maas-Hoffman salinity tolerance tables that consider various crops. You can easily find it on the internet, and this is probably one of the oldest versions. If you determine the salinity of your soil with conductivity meter, you can use this table to predict the approximate yield you will get. I think that's pretty cool. Obviously, yield depends on so many variables other than salinity, and that's why these tables are given in percentage instead of the absolute values. You might have heard about the limiting factor rule, or Liebig's barrel, where the plant's growth is dictated by the weakest element of the system, such as scarcest nutrient, or, in our case, high level of salinity. Thanks to Maas-Hoffman tables, we can make sure that salinity doesn't become our limiting factor before spending money on super expensive hybrids, fertilizers, or irrigation systems. So, why salts are so bad for our plants? The agricultural and scientific communities have been having this conversation ongoing for a long time. And one of the things that is being disrupted by high soil salinity is actually the water flow into the plant. And the mechanism of water entering the plant depends on osmotic pressure between the soil's solution and the plant's roots, which of course depends on soil salinity. So let's look into the osmotic pressure a little bit closer for a second. By definition, osmosis is a process where water molecules move from an area of low solute concentration to the area of high solute concentration through a semi-permeable membrane. For our plants, this semi-permeable membrane is their cell membrane. When salt concentration in the soil solution is high, it's really hard for the plant to uptake water because the pressure gradient between the plant's root and soil solution becomes really low. And water is one of the most important factors in growing any crop for a number of reasons. It participates in photosynthesis, It also controls nutrients uptake. Thanks to water, plants can regulate their temperature. Let's say it's 37 or 40 degrees Celsius outside, and it's really hard for the plant cell to function in these conditions. Thanks to transpiration, which is a process of leaves evaporating water from their surfaces, plants can cool down. And that's why the lion's share of water in the plant is usually used on transpiration. Cell's dehydration, also known as plasmolysis, affects plant seedlings the most. Because their root system and leaves are still underdeveloped, such plants lose moisture easily, and salinized soil makes it even harder for them to uptake water. This photo is an example of such a problem in tomato seedlings grown in the salinized substrate in Kherson Oblast, Ukraine. When the farmers noticed that the part of the plants was damaged, they made a lab analysis of the soil. Here's the lab report they got back. Expectedly, plants that were grown under dehydration conditions because of the soil salinization were more damaged. But you can see, it's not just an EC test on the screen, but a detailed analysis of cation anion content in the soil. Each of these ions has a specific toxic effect on the plants, and that is why we're talking about the importance of knowing your chemical type of salinization. It turns out that, for example, chloride or carbon salinization predominance is more harmful to the plants than, let's say, sulfate chloride or chloride sulfate salinization, because salts that easily penetrate into the cell are more toxic to the plant. Now, let's talk about how different plants tolerate salinity. If you have salinization on your field, but you don't really have an opportunity to cure it yet, you might really want to pick a crop that is salt resistant, such as beets, spinach, cotton, wheat, alfalfa, grapes, and olives. On the other hand, pepper, strawberry, corn, or cucumber might be not the best choice because they're very salt sensitive. And generally speaking, vegetables that reproduce with cutlings, layerings, and seedlings, or other means of vegetative reproduction, these guys are not the best choice because they're salt sensitive. And of course, it's just a glimpse of the list of salt-sensitive and salt-resistant plants that you can easily find online. It also depends on the variety you choose to grow. For example, agroanalyst specialists shared that parthenocarpic hybrids of cucumber do much better on salinized soils than bee-pollinated ones. According to the same specialists, even with usually salt-sensitive strawberries, one can still get a wonderful harvest on mildly salinized soils if they choose the right variety. On salinized soils of the Crimea Peninsula, varieties such as Sweet Charlie or California did extremely badly with soils with electrical conductivity more than 1.5. However, locally brought varieties such as Hanei or Krvnchanka gave a wonderful harvest with the same soil salinization. In this photo, you can see strawberry seedlings whose leaves are very small and shrinking with necrotic tissues near the edges. These are typical symptoms of dehydration due to soil salinization. And in this particular case, by the way, the problem turned out to be the irrigation water, not the substrate. The intentional manipulation of salt concentration can also be a powerful tool in controlling the direction of plants' development. It's especially popular among farmers who use hydroponics. For example, if the vegetative organs of the plant are strong and robust, but the fruits and flowers are not feeling so well, the agronomists usually increase soil salinity so that the plant would get the signal to start building on the generative organs. And vice versa, if the vegetative parts are weak but the generative parts are too strong, agronomists decrease soil salt concentration. Interestingly enough, it's been proved that, compared to fresh water, saltwater irrigation actually improves tomato quality, but it decreases the tomato yield. You can look up this paper if you want. I found it really cool. And lastly, here are the things you should know before buying a new field. First and foremost, you should do the soil salinity test, which will help you map the soil salinity levels on your field, like it's shown on this map. Such maps can help you choose where to grow your plants. For example, Red spots on the map are probably not the best areas for growing salt-sensitive crops, and the yellow zones might be a better option. Then you might really want to determine the soil electrical conductivity and get a detailed test on cations and anions in the soil to know which ion is predominant, and then you're good to go. Thank you so much for your attention. In the next episode of this series, we will be talking about means of amelioration or how to cure your soil, so stay tuned.